Hello and welcome. Welcome to the Galien Foundation Week of Innovation webinars. Wherever you're joining, whether it's New York City or from the comfort of your home. My name is MaryAnne Rizk. I am the Senior Vice President of R&D Digital Solutions at IQVIA Technologies, and I am privileged and honored to be here today, not only to facilitate a really exciting session on innovation with our shared colleagues and partners, but also talk about how the Galien Foundation's mission is really to innovate and improve the human conditions. And this year, we recognize there's a record nominees of 67 organizations across 3 categories. And again, we welcome for an engaging session. And at this moment, I will introduce our panelist speaker. The session will include a vote to poll a question from the audience. We'll go through a series of questions, and we look forward to an engaging session where you can use the Q&A function. With me today, I have the following polls that you can select of what is the most important signal element of the future global policy agenda to advance health innovations that improve the human condition. Please take a moment and conduct your vote. Thank you for voting. And so with me on the panel, I have an esteemed set of colleagues that are really looking to share their perspectives on areas of R&D change as we're looking at that pandemic. And with me this afternoon, I have Dr. Amanda Panchik from the Executive Director of Clinical Development at Merck, Dr. Dennis Herby from the Chief Scientific Officer of Cigna Technologies, Dr. Daniel Everett, who is the VP and Chief Medical Officer at TB Alliance, and finally, Dr. Mark Sullivan, founder and managing director of the Medicines Development for Global Health. Thank you and welcome all. The first session we're going to be talking about today is really on this topic of infectious disease and reproductive health, looking to understand what are some of the areas of change. And when we think about each company's obligation to really help drive the transformational change, many of us here within the pandemic have allowed our organizations to look at key changes in the way we are considering areas of clinical development, how we're bridging the gap in technologies, and how we've also been making some decisions in partnership with regulatory agencies. So the first question I asked our panelists here is, why did your company choose to focus on a particular disease state and indication associated with a product? And in what ways can the product represent therapeutic breakthroughs, and how significant is that level of unmet need and unmet medical need? And perhaps Dr. Amanda, you may want to start.
Sure. Thank you, MaryAnne, and thanks to the Foundation for putting this webinar together. So for Merck, we have a long history in infectious diseases with decades of experience in the discovery and development of novel medicines and vaccines to fight infectious diseases. And one of those areas of focus in today's world is antimicrobial resistance, particularly among gram-negative bacteria, which is a huge threat to global public health. So to combat this issue, we need a number of new and improved antibiotics for the growing threat. And Ricarbriel, or imipenem, psilocybin, and ribactam, was developed to target some of the most common mechanisms of resistance in gram-negative pathogens, specifically the production of beta-lactamases by bacteria, which render the beta-lactams ineffective. So, because of a long history, the real responsibility that Merck sees that we have in this area, and the serious threat of antimicrobial resistance, we are focusing on novel antibiotics as one of the things we're doing in infectious diseases to address this area of public health.
And given the pandemic, Dr. Amanda, have you seen a change in terms of that development process?
No, I mean, I think if anything, because of our long history, we feel a particular responsibility to continue to focus on infectious diseases and unmet medical need in this area. I think where the change maybe, or where I think it was happening before, but now is even more important, and we recognize as an industry that We need to continue to invest in this area to address current threats as well as emerging threats, as well as really support collaboration among companies, among governments, and beyond, to address these threats together as a community.
Yeah, and I like what you said about not only expecting what the threat is today, but also future proofing, when and if this pandemic should ever come again. Love to hear from the other panelists. I mean, recognizing to drive healthcare forward, we understand the world is moving at an incredibly rapid pace. And just was just mentioned, it's more valuable than ever to really consider aspects of design and looking at the disease state. If I can call on some of the other panelists, Dr. Dennis Herby, would you like to add to your perspectives as well?
Sure. In our particular case, following the 2001 anthrax attacks, we focused all of our efforts on developing countermeasures against bioterrorism agents as well as emerging diseases, in particular smallpox, which was considered at the time and still is the foremost category A biothreat. Now, although one would say that smallpox has been eradicated, why are you worrying about it? In fact, live smallpox stocks exist in several labs around the world. One could recreate smallpox from published sequences using synthetic biology. And there's always the possibility that an existing pox virus, such as monkeypox, might acquire enhanced pathogenicity through mutation. Now, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us the enormous societal toll of being unprepared. As bad as COVID-19 is, smallpox would be far worse. It has prolonged incubation period, it's far more transmissible and far more lethal. Now, although we do have effective vaccines, they're associated with some severe side effects, and they're not going to be deployed in time to contain an outbreak, and many, many infected individuals would die. Fortunately, through collaborative work, such as Amanda discussed, we now have the first and only approved smallpox antiviral, which we call TPOXX. It took a 15-year collaboration between various branches of the U.S. government and SIGA that culminated in the regulatory approval of this drug in 2018. The drug is now stockpiled in the U.S. as well as several other countries, and it's available for deployment when we need it. So unlike COVID, hopefully smallpox reemerges, we're going to be ready to contain it.
I love the confidence and being able to recognize that the change and the transformation and what we're expected to see. And thank you for your perspective. And also, as we're recognizing, what was mentioned earlier is collaboration is more of an activity where we're forging ways of considering either sharing data or looking at disease states. Could I ask some of the panels members to discuss how have you seen collaboration being formed or forged where you're looking at some of the insights that you just shared? So perhaps Dr. Daniel and or Dr. Mark, if you want to share perspectives in that regard, maybe talking about what Dr. Amanda, Dr. Dennis just mentioned, but really understanding as we're moving ahead here, what are you seeing as relevance that you may want to, as from a collaboration perspective, as we're accelerating to understand insights, how are you thinking about, data sharing or research development, sharing insights?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Rizk, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you all. So I work with, our organization is the TB Alliance, or the Global Alliance for TB Drug Development. We are a nonprofit organization, and we are completely dedicated. Our entire mission is to developing improved drug regimens to treat tuberculosis. So we're focused on that disease as a disease of poverty, and TB still, even with COVID, in the background, is the deadliest infectious disease. It kills more people every year than any other infectious disease. So that keeps us really dedicated to the mission. And 5 years ago, as we were developing a new drug called pretomanid, we realized we had the opportunity to combine it with two other drugs, bedaquiline and linezolid. And I'll get to the collaboration question in a minute. To treat the most highly resistant forms of TB, which really were a death sentence as recently as 4 or 5 years ago. Long-term survival rates and relapse-free cure was no higher than 20% in South Africa, where we were doing a lot of the work. So pretomanid to be used in the regimen with the other 2 drugs was approved by the FDA last year. And it's a 3-drug all oral regimen taken for 6 months, which is a giant leap forward, with also a 90% long-term relapse-free cure rate. And that compares to what in the past was 18 to 24 or forever treatment with 7 or 8 drugs, many of which had side effects and very poor outcomes. So that's been very exciting, taking that forward. Collaboratively, we are sometimes what's known as a product development partnership. So we're an organization of about 50 people, but we work closely with other pharmaceutical companies, governments, private foundations, a whole wide variety to leverage and develop drugs like a pharmaceutical company would, but with pulling in the resources from all in a highly collaborative way.
I think alliances and forging abilities to really think around how we are have one common goal of really serving the patient, right? And what we can do to consider moving from the ordinary to the extraordinary, and looking at the ambition that we all share to help patients, do more, feel better, live longer, and really redefine what healthcare was truly meant to do. And leveraging that, whether it's the power of insights, data, technology. Certainly would love to hear from Mr. Mark, who we were sharing perspectives, just even thinking about from a clinical operations and just understanding how even R&D is being conducted, and some of the ways that you're expecting change to happen in addition to collaboration. But Mark, would you may want to share some perspectives in terms of how you're seeing the change and the impact in terms of collaboration and also using different technologies?
Thanks, MaryAnne. Yeah, our organization approaches the whole development process a little differently. So from our perspective, we select products based on the product and the characteristics of the product and its likelihood of success. And then secondly, look at the disease area. So we're quite broad in the focus that we have. We're interested in infectious diseases, and we're interested in infectious diseases of low and middle income countries. So that's our focus. And we're unusual, as well as the TB Alliance is, in being a nonprofit. So that's, again, a very unusual model. So, inherent in the fact that the group here, all of us work in what we would call market failure under typical circumstances. And COVID is your perfect example of market failure. A discussion a year ago would have ended up with people laughing you out of the office if you were asking for cash or any sort of support to kind of do anything. So this is kind of how it feels when you're living in an area with a disease that's probably pretty treatable, but the money isn't there. So I think that one of the key things that is incumbent when you're working in areas of market failure are the need to collaborate. You really need to be working in a collaborative manner. You need to be working with lots of different people. You need to find the way to get through the regulatory hurdle in order to have the impact that you're looking to have. And that can really only be achieved by collaboration. And my early career was spent in HIV clinical research, where collaboration was such an integral part of the process that I think there were a lot of lessons that we learned at that time in how to tackle something that looked terribly intractable. And I think it was a combination of industry, regulators, and the community coming together that was the key difference there, that I feel really drove genuine innovation in the product development process. And I hope that's what we'll see as well as a result of COVID, that we'll start to see some of the intercompany barriers, the regulatory environment changing and aligning, and then the product development part of things as well being refined. I think we can all do better on all aspects of that.
That resonates really well. And just to also recognize that the FDA here in the US have been moving faster than we've ever seen before. For example, we here saw the FDA approve an antibody test for COVID-19 in literally a matter of days, which would have taken years. And so we're putting enormous amount of energy towards figuring out how we could partner even with regulatory agencies where there may be flexible and understanding how we can accommodate things, whether it's digital technologies or process. And I think this really allows us all to think about this new infrastructure in terms of finding a vaccine or a cure and how we really are redefining healthcare as we're moving forward. I'm just going to quote something that I heard from Dr. Amy Aberthy from the FDA saying that, when we think about areas of collaboration, we need to be creative partners in that journey. And no idea is too small. So the point of being left out, Mark, I think we certainly want to encourage disruptive thinking. We want to encourage what if. We want to encourage areas of thinking about funding for things that may need to be proven and then proof of value. And so I think where COVID may have had some organizations think that we're stopping, we may be pivoting in some of our thinking. And so it's just refreshing to see some of the outcomes that's happening and that's encouraging us. So really pleased to hear about partnerships and alliances. I, for one, I work in significant amount of partnerships and alliances, really helping to foster creative thinking. So whether it's from a digital perspective, data, and also services, recognizing that's incredibly important. So just maybe moving on to our next question. Is there a measurable impact that anyone here can cite on a clinical outcomes for patients with any particular product you may be working on? What has been the clinical response to that product thus far? Where we're seeing, one of the most important areas, where we're looking at vaccine development. And as mentioned earlier from Dr. Daniel indicating that, COVID is one of the leading, most deadliest infectious disease. Just very curious to hear from the group in terms of what's been some of that impact that you can cite in terms of outcomes for patients and in your careers, and also what you think that might be related to the clinical response to that product. Any perspectives on that?
I can give a little bit of perspective. We have a unique situation because we've actually, with an approved drug, fortunately, never been able to treat a human smallpox patient, and we hope that continues. We have, of course, done clinical trials for safety and blood levels, and that's all been fine. We have been able to use our drug in a number of compassionate cases. These are typically immunocompromised individuals who come in contact with another pox virus, often vaccinia, which is a smallpox vaccine. We've been able to use the drug in these individuals, and it's generally had very good outcomes. I think from our standpoint, it's more informational. We want everyone around the globe to know that this drug exists, so that if there's an orthopox infection or smallpox, God forbid, which should reoccur, that it's available. And so we aggressively publish, we aggressively go to conferences, we work with the World Health Organization on the Approval Committee, making sure that scientists and clinicians around the world know that the drug exists so they can use it if they need to. Hopefully we won't have any clinical experience with smallpox.
I'm so glad you said that. I think communication and access information to patients is really critical and key. And it's interesting, even in my own network and family, recognizing I've been dedicating my career in clinical research for the last 20 plus years. And, where you only have 5% of the world's population participating in clinical trial. Now with that information of understanding insights, right, is incredibly important. And now I believe the world is leaning in to not only have a committed understanding about their health, but what's also out there. And I think the ability to communicate, where traditionally we went to conferences, we thank the Galien Foundation for making sessions like this possible. So while we unfortunately can't be with each other in the same room in New York City, we may be able to reach maybe even a wider cohort of people, right, attending and listening and also communicating that. Thank you so much for your input. Any others in terms of outcomes? I mean, at the end of the day, we're really looking to see what are some of the measurable ways that we can change that clinical significance, some of the quality of life standards, information and access is key. Welcome other perspectives as well.
I can maybe comment on the information piece, because I think that's critically important in so many areas of infectious diseases, particularly in antimicrobial resistance, where you have so many unique types of resistance and different drugs are coming out that maybe treat different things. So Recarbrio is fairly new, having just become widely available in January of this year. But one thing we've seen change for the positive in terms of information sharing is that IDSA, Infectious Disease Society of America, just issued their first treatment guidance as opposed to their treatment guidelines. So treatment guidance for the treatment of antimicrobial resistant gram-negative bacterial infections included Recarbrio as a treatment option for certain types of resistant bacteria. And this is a new type of document that they're planning to issue to be more responsive to the rapid changes in the environment, the availability of new drugs. And guidances and treatment guidelines are important to clinicians who have patients they want to treat, want to know how to treat them, what's recommended, and need information about new agents. So guidelines that are maybe only updated in the antibacterial area every 10 years or more, many of the current ones are quite outdated, don't account for new treatments that are becoming available. So an approach like this, a more nimble process where guidances can be developed for these emerging conditions and bring in new available agents, a great help to both clinicians and to patients in terms of we're rapidly sharing information that's out there as it emerges.
I can't tell you how this resonates so well with me. I think just when we look at the patient journey and that patient engagement, empowering, engaging all across from development even to commercialization. And so when recognizing that in terms of being able to get that communication out there more broadly by partnering, with companies that can use things like artificial intelligence and machine learning, mobile capabilities, we have found innovative ways to engage and reach patients wherever they are. And also looking on how we're bringing, as one example, hundreds of thousands of, let's say, oncology patients into a highly personalized, engaged virtual community so they can share openly and also understand, ask questions, whether it's either consenting on a clinical trial, getting engaged, and staying involved. I think, now could have been a better time where we have access to the latest AI and ML capabilities, like what we call medical Internet of Things, MIOT, but certainly recognizing that being able to have information to share with patients couldn't have been an easier way with the advent of technologies. And when we talk to patients, we know that approximately 72% of patients want to be more engaged, want to have access where they can use their devices like they would do anything else from a consumer perspective and get informed. And so pleased to see that we have so much more to share in traditional and more fluid ways. Welcome other discussions in terms of, broadly communicating and engaging. And I think we're still talking about the impact for patients. Any other perspectives from the panelists before we go on to the next questions?
Yeah, maybe I could just say a word about, getting access to a new therapy out there, particularly, for a disease of poverty like tuberculosis, which is largely in low and middle income countries. We, started with the clinical trials that were able to fortunately show with the new regimen, 90% success rate, cure rate, going way up from what it was with just 3 oral drugs, not 7 or 8 drugs for 18 to 24 months. But we realized that just getting that first regulatory approval with the FDA, that was just a first start. The issue is getting access to an affordable regimen really out there broadly to, the hundreds of thousands of patients, even with this sort of highly resistant TB. And so we, as a small, largely R&D organization, we don't have a manufacturing facility. We clearly had to partner with a commercialization partner. And our first one was Mylan Pharmaceuticals, who's been an excellent partner. We now also have McLeod's and Fosun in China, to be able to work with us to get approvals going around the world. So we were very pleased. Within the first year, we got the FDA approval, we got the European Medicines Agency approval, and we got approval in India by their regulatory authority. And then WHO guidelines have been updated that include the regimen in new guidelines, and approximately 10 other files to other regulatory authorities around the world have taken place. So it's a lot of work, and for us, it really relies on the partners that have people on the ground that can do these regulatory files and get it out there. But we are pleased that the Global Drug Facility now at a very affordable price has made Pritomanid available to about 150 low and middle income countries beyond Europe and the United States that have their approvals.
That's an outstanding outcome. Congratulations. Any other perspectives?
Yeah,
Yes,
just make a quick comment. Yeah, so our drug has a similar issue. The area that it's used in is sub-Saharan Africa, and so it's the challenge is once you've got your stringent regulatory authority approval is to then begin to thinking about how you're going to roll that out. What's the regulatory environment under which it's provided, and because it's expected as a donated product, how do you fund the donation and how do you sustain that? And those circumstances require quite a lot of work and effort and finances in that post-approval period. So for us, our focus was getting FDA approval, a stringent regulatory authority to review the data first, and then we're working through WHO and the local regulatory authorities in Africa to get approval there, both in guidelines and in regulatory approval, to allow provision. So at the moment, although we've got an incredibly promising compound, we haven't yet seen the impact of that in the field towards the elimination of the disease that we work on, which is called river blindness. So that's a kind of a frustration, I guess, and it does speak to the challenges of working in these excuse me, in these kinds of locations, and in the expectation of the field in low middle income countries of what happens with their drugs, where they come from, how they arrive, and it's a little bit on the passive side that there's an expectation that a large pharmaceutical company will be able to negotiate all of those aspects and bring the product through and donate it. And when that's not the case, it does make it significantly more challenging. And it's for small organizations like us and for groups like TB Alliance and other PDPs, it's a particular challenge of getting to the impact point. So I think, when you're working in these areas of what I've called before market failure, it requires a totally different approach, and it requires very different thinking. When you get your approval, usually we're all thinking, that's it, we're done. That's now distribution, and the cash will start rolling in. And for most of us in our areas, the cash still rolls out, and it creates quite a challenge.
I have to say, I was a former Merck alumni. I first started my career at the headquarters of White House Station at the time. There was a statue that you were reminded that from George W. Merck, that Merck is for the people and the profits follow. I don't know, Dr. Amanda, if you may want to share any of your perspectives, but we recognize that in a rapidly evolving industry where we put the patients at the center, we recognize that our mission is really to provide those treatments and cures. And also you got that balance of, from a funding perspective, but not sure, Dr. Amanda, if you want to comment on that as well, since there's clear relevance in some of the work that Merck does.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's still very much the core belief at Merck, and fuels our core missions. The thinking about the market failure piece and how we think about how we invest in the science to deliver the products, that's that's where I think we need to be going, and where, and I mean, I guess a good thing about the COVID pandemic is that some hopefully formerly neglected areas will become more priorities, and people see that the reason for the investment in this area. But things that are as widespread as some of the diseases we're talking about, like antimicrobial resistance, still don't have the investment that they should by any stretch. And like Mark was saying, you think, okay, well, we'll get to approval and mission accomplished. That's it. We've got it. It's all, problem is solved. But that's not true at all. It's definitely not true in antibacterials, where we've seen company after company fail with approved products. And to address that issue and keep investment going in these critical areas, that's one of the reasons that Merck and a number of other companies got together to fund the AMR, Antimicrobial Resistance Action Fund, which is a collaboration of multiple companies, other organizations, financial institutions, to fund antibiotic R&D, to bridge that gap between early science and getting actual products to patients who need them, and ensure that we don't have those failures of approved products, of good products that are going to solve some of these public health issues.
You know, I want to go back to perhaps something I heard Dr. Daniel mention about partnerships and alliances, recognizing that, you know, from an infectious disease perspective, you know, COVID being the most highly deadly, you know, really we recognize we're taking care of patients, right, in our healthcare system. We have this ethical responsibility to ensure there's absolute accuracy, and we're looking at appropriately getting patients medicine at the appropriate time. And the world's changed, right? We know we have a new business requirement in that value chain. So it's not just enough and no longer about quality. You were mentioning approvals. We can't sacrifice quality, but we have to introduce also speed. Speed is a new requirement in terms of what does that mean for each of us? How are we able to deliver on the promise of what we have to give to patients, and redefining healthcare in those implementations? So whether it's partnering, whether it's data sharing, whether it's avid use of technologies, all these are different mechanisms that, you know, we now have available to look at. And so it really opens up a responsibility that each of us can contribute and say, what can we do to help redefine this evolution that we're in? And, you know, leads me to my next question is, what do we believe now are the challenges that are confronted when transitioning from maybe an early proof of concept to human trials and ultimately to market authorization? So really relevant and kind of how we're rolling into the next discussion. Really would love to hear about any lessons of your experiences, what that maybe are adding to better public understanding, awareness of medical innovation and process. So I think it's important to recognize that we're in a trial in clinical development, but really around reinforcing some of the proof of concepts, helping patients and market authorization. So any input from the audience on this one? I'm sorry, the panelists on this one?
I have a couple quick comments. We had a relatively unique development and regulatory experience in that we're developing a drug for a disease that doesn't exist. So there were no smallpox patients to test it on. It would obviously be unethical to infect anybody deliberately with smallpox. And so it was necessary for us, under the auspices of the animal rule, to work iteratively with the FDA over many years to develop the appropriate animal models using surrogate animals, surrogate viruses. The scientific community as a whole was involved in the process through advisory panels and blue ribbon committees. And in the end, between the FDA and the scientific community, they developed a set of quantitative criteria that could be used to test the development of a smallpox antiviral and demonstrates the likely to be safe. Now, the point I wanted to make is, to my knowledge, this is the first novel small molecule developed under the animal rule. I think it's important because now it provides a paradigm and a blueprint for future drugs or vaccines to be developed against some of these potential pandemic agents and these viruses and bacteria we don't understand well. There's now a way to do this and get these drugs to approval.
Yeah, well, it's recognizing that being able to market those conditions for the cohort of patients is clearly important as you're targeting. Any other perspectives in sharing how your companies are transitioning from early proof of concept to market authorization?
From our point of view, we have a very kind of familiar, you know, product development process. So we use, we outsource, we acquire the best services that we can get. We have a very project management kind of typical structure of taking a product through. I think the key thing though that underlies the issue, particularly in the areas around this panel, is how all of that is funded. You know, when you're working in, and you know, I hate to drag it back to dollars, but it comes back to dollars. You know, how do you fund all of that development work? You know, I think we've each come up with a mechanism to do that, but you know, we're covering a few diseases here, and there are an awful lot more.
Yeah, I'd like to echo.
Yeah, go ahead, Dan.
Oh no, I didn't mean to cut you off. Sorry.
No, that's okay. No, I think this is something that you know, with sufficient funding to support the kind of work that we're all looking to achieve, the development will look vanilla. It would look like everything else. You know, you'll just run through all of the things that we need to run through. We will respond to the data. We will be driven by the usual things that a drug development organization is driven by. But you know, the main issue is how that's supported. And our drug took 18 years from the first time the Tropical Diseases Research Group started to look at it through to approval. And that's a tortured history. And it's so difficult because it got picked up and dropped and picked up and dropped on the way through. And that was the case because of, at the end of the day, there's zero market opportunity. Dan?
Yeah, so I was just going to say, I was going to echo the challenges of funding, you know, particularly for neglected diseases, but actually all of infectious diseases has that problem. So those of us like Dr. Sullivan's group and TB Alliance that are in the nonprofit area, we rely on, you know, foundation grants, government grants. We're very appreciative of our long-term donors, but they're stretched thin a bit now with the demands of COVID and the fact that some of the governments that traditionally fund us have fewer tax revenues coming in. Some are funded by taxes on airline tickets, which have gone down. So that's a challenge. And then certainly in the more for-profit area, you know, we've seen a number of companies actually exit the infectious disease area and just give up, sell off their portfolios because, you know, it's hard to make money there. My hat's off to two of our colleagues, Otsuka Pharmaceuticals and Johnson & Johnson are two companies that developed a new tuberculosis drug. They're the only two new drugs in the last 30 years, literally, until we had our approval this year. We're the third drug. But it shows there aren't many people in that kind of space. And it's great that, you know, Merck's doing what they are. But it's a real challenge.
If I might.
I could echo just slightly. This is important. The market failure for neglected diseases or for potential pandemic agents is always going to prevent these from being commercial targets. It's always going to require collaborations between companies and either philanthropic organizations or more likely federal governments. Now, I think COVID has shown us how expensive a pandemic is. And if we really want to be prepared for the next one, then these partnerships are going to have to fund the development, ultimately the approval, and importantly, the stockpiling of these drugs. And that's only the start of it. Because once you put these type of drugs, whether it's for neglected disease or potential pandemic agent in, they have shelf lives. And so they have to be replenished at a certain period of time. And so this is going to be a big governmental requirement if we're going to actually make this happen.
But we still need to focus on therapies for patients, right? So we need to I think looking at and hearing this perspective, when we look at from an R&D perspective, trial continuity and looking at accelerating maybe innovative approaches to maybe reduce traditional ways of what clinical trial costs. And, whether that's in maybe designing a trial with patient-centric outcomes. Earlier, we talked about data sharing and alliances and collaboration. And we recognize that if we look at the top two costs of clinical trials, the largest cost of a clinical trials is patients dropping out from enrollment, but we've introduced telehealth. In the last 9 months, there's been a increase of approximately 83% increase across global pharma, med device, and biotechs. We also recognize that the second largest cost of a clinical study is the monitoring, and introducing the remote monitoring capability where CRAs traditionally would be jumping on those planes and those costs, right? So through this pandemic, what we have grown to understand as a community, as an industry, that pre-COVID, where we traditionally have, complex protocols, or looking at how we improve protocol simplification, how we can engage with remote site monitoring techniques, leveraging digital technologies, looking at novel ways of thinking about either randomization or even designing processes, but also the communication that we talked about, digitally communicating. And I think we are embarking in a new era of adapting the concept of how can we reduce risk? How can we have either early signal detection of risk so that you don't have to wait for that second or third phase of a clinical study? Are there early indications of the data that can allow us to be able to recalibrate and or partner? I think it's a very exciting time with Innovation Week that we're in, where we're thinking about, here are all the challenges we have. Funding is a really important topic. And I can just share with you a use case, just speaking with a client earlier this morning, that when leveraging data just to even predict the right sites to pick for a particular trial, just an indication where we're able to help with 10x accuracy, accelerating it by 5 months, and even translating it to profound savings of $80 million per study. And so we just know that when we're having the ability to collaborate as partners, there gives us an opportunity to think about how we want to run and drive and design more precise trials, how we're able to recruit and set up the right site engagement. And so while, that's more from a ClinOps perspective, I'm incredibly motivated in hearing about some of the opportunities, some of the newer challenges that has occurred during this pandemic for us to think about, and how we may be able to change the status quo. So I welcome an understanding from this panel in terms of where you believe the next wave of innovation is going to help some of the challenges that you've just brought up today, whether it's leveraging and forging partnerships and relationships, thinking about a more digital perspective, or maybe partnering with regulatory agencies, as we're seeing some of that collaboration happening. And as we're closing the panel here, would love to hear from each of you in terms of where do you think that next step of innovation is going to occur? Where do you see that trending happening? What are some of the new areas of science that might help drive against the flight of infectious disease, where we're now all communicating digitally, maybe more real time than not, but really understanding how folks like from the Galien Foundation, the committee, can help us drive different innovative concepts. Very fortunate that in the last few months, there's been a number of innovation webinars just talking about some of these disruptive thinking and bringing together leaders like yourself. So very interested in hearing your perspectives about where you feel, either from a scientific, a clinical, ClinOps, partnership, collaboration, where do you believe that next wave frontier of innovation may be occurring?
It's a nice frame set, MaryAnne, because it has to be the entire ecosystem. We have to be thinking about all of the elements in the ecosystem. And I do think there will be some changes in the way that we conduct clinical trials, that there are some refinements, there are some ways to save money, to do things more intelligently, to use some of the techniques. So you're sitting in my study in Australia, it's 6-ish in the morning. The fact that we can do this and have these sort of conversations is fantastic, and that will change things. There's no question about that. But and we do use a lot of model-informed drug development. I think one of the key things as a drug developer is your mindset of kill and kill early, And so, you should be, and we are designing experiments that will result in the termination of the program rather than the continuation of the program. And so, we use a lot of model-informed approaches, mostly in the clinical pharmacology setting, to really understand the pharmacokinetic, pharmacodynamic relationship of our drug, so that we get a very good feel for that as early as we possibly can. I think then, if you look at the process of all of the data that's generated, we are, as a group, because of the regulatory framework, and the regulatory framework is the reason that I do what I do, we are risk averse. So we have brought in a group of people and a mindset and a culture which is conservative and risk averse. And so, with that, I think that has to be challenged. I don't think you can change necessarily the risk profile that you're willing to accept, but the way that we approach things can also often be a little cumbersome and a little overdone because we are risk averse. So I think the way that we look at monitoring, for example, the kind of standard practices around monitoring may not necessarily be the most efficient. And I know that there is a push to try and be a lot more guided by the data and what you're experiencing. So I think there are elements across all of this, but perhaps the other part of it, I just don't think we want to understate the value and contribution that the regulators currently do make. And if you think about the number of stringent regulatory authorities in the world, the answer is that there is the EU and 6 others. So they're a jewel in the crown. We need to really be very proud of the stringent regulatory authorities that we have. We had such an excellent experience with the FDA. They are innovators, and they're open to discussions such as we're seeing around COVID. So I think it's fantastic that we can work with groups like that. And for us, I think if we're able to begin to look at what it is you serve to the regulator and when you provide that information, we may be able to be quicker and smarter in this process, perhaps with, in the post-approval period, putting some of the emphasis of what needs to be done into that period, so that the development process is a little cheaper, a little less expensive, a little quicker, but there's more incumbencies at the far end once you're through approval that can help you to generate real world data. So I think that whole ecosystem, not that it's not a big thing, but we need to look at it.
Yes. Thank you. That was excellent.
Yeah, I'd also say I really appreciate the collaboration of the regulators, particularly the US FDA and the EMA. I mean, they've really been good colleagues with us in the area of a neglected disease to try to help us be successful. That's been great. I might say just a word on the scientific side of an opportunity we have to do better. One of the reasons that tuberculosis, kills more people than any other infectious disease is that the treatment's so long. So if I get TB and go to Columbia University to get the best treatment for drugs susceptible to TB, it'll still be 6 months. A trial was reported just last week that suggests maybe there will be a 4-month treatment. But at any rate, that's a long time to treat somebody, say in rural Tanzania, that has to walk to a clinic and keep taking medicines for that amount of time. So the real game changer, and what our aspiration is, to get this down to, let's say, a 2-week treatment or even a 1-month treatment to make it more like another infectious disease. And I think what we're seeing is, to do that, it's going to take more than just powerful antibiotics, but it's also going to involve harnessing the immune system, perhaps combining an immune modulator of some sort to do a better job of attacking the tuberculosis bacteria in combination. Of course, that's going to take a lot of collaboration with others to get the right combination together.
Excellent.
I can maybe comment on some of the scientific or trial execution aspects as well. Yeah, I think what we've learned from the pandemic is, with so many parts of the world and so many centers being overwhelmed by the pandemic and caring for patients with COVID, it has stalled in some places a lot of their other research efforts. So we have the trying to solve the scientific problem of COVID treatment, but it's also slowing down, perhaps progress on other trials because the research capabilities at any given site that's conducting research may be overwhelmed. So I think, as we move forward, one of the things we can do is figure out how to better use our networks and other research capabilities. So some of the inefficiencies that, some of the other panelists were talking about. And also in a lot of infectious disease areas, improvements in diagnostics, more rapid diagnostics can both ultimately help identifying the patients that need to be treated, but can also improve our trial execution by more quickly identifying the right patients to be enrolled in the trial because they have the right disease that we want to study.
Thank you for that. Any other comments? We're going to open it up for the Q&A in terms of ways of innovation. Otherwise, I'm going to take questions from the audience. I welcome you to submit them. And here we go. The first question, I don't know if Mark, you've already answered this yet but a question came in from the audience, Mr. Sam Brower. Playing devil's advocate for a second. Sovaldi was a financial success for Gilead, while Tamiflu, I think, had an overall market exceeding $20 billion. Perhaps the distinction is between potential infectious diseases which don't have an existing market and infectious diseases which do have a market, such as herpes. Any thoughts from the audience?
I was going to tap a response, but I thought I'd just speak. So
yeah,
it clearly is different. There are some infectious diseases where you can generate substantial return, and there are others that you can't. I think there may be a modest market for some of the areas that we work on, but far and away most of the things that we focus on, there's nothing. It's all out the door. So those are the areas where, and it's if you take it back to the COVID situation and that theoretical discussion that you might have had in September to December of last year about a potential threat from MERS, even the Middle Eastern version. To have that conversation with somebody, unless they see a market opportunity, you're not going to raise the money. And unless you can convince a government that this is important for your people or for the people over there, you're also not going to raise the money. So that's our challenge. Money is needed to answer these questions, and unless you can link what you do to a commercial return, you're going to struggle to get the funds back. So not all infectious diseases are the same. Some have been impressively lucrative, but most of the stuff that we work on is anything but.
Yeah, I think if you just look at the example of like over the last 40 years, only 3 new drugs have been developed for tuberculosis. Look at the field of HIV/AIDS, very important, but I've lost track. There's certainly over 30, probably 40 new therapies, and I mean, it's still a terrible disease, but a lot of it is just, where's the market, where's the money, and who is it a disease of poverty? Or like HIV/AIDS, yes, it's a disease of poverty, but it's also a disease of, in wealthy countries as well. Just like flu, the comment about Tamiflu or some of the others, and certainly COVID vaccine will make a nice amount for some companies that are successful in that area.
Well, this panel was meant to talk a little bit about pandemic preparedness, and that's the big challenge here. We're talking about diseases that are common, but what about the ones that are uncommon? Then the next emerging pathogen is going to be Nipah, it's going to be Hendra, it's going to be a rare influenza, it's going to be a bacteria. And so one has to attract the funding and move these things to the forefront, or it'll be just like COVID, where we're playing catch up, and it'll take years before we can turn the pandemic around. So that's the challenge, is creating the market.
I think that's true. And I would maybe comment that it needs to be better coordinated than this effort. I think in the individual organizations that have sponsored their own products through development have done a great job. When you step outside of that to the repurposing world, it is, I've described this publicly, it's a zoo out there, with horrific clinical trials, a peer review process that's absolutely broken, and a waste of human time, effort, and money on promotion of yourself and your department and creating a publication with which no one can do anything. And hydroxychloroquine is controversial in the US for reasons I don't understand, but there were hundreds, literally hundreds of individual clinical trials to answer a question about whether it works, yes or no. And if you had that in the hands of an individual organization who could have answered that question very simply and very clearly. So when you have a feeding frenzy like we've seen that is uncoordinated, we're going to end up with very hard to interpret data, and we have to be better coordinated in this process, which comes back to your point, MaryAnne, about collaboration and data sharing. I just think it's really important that we go back to our core principles. In fact, our society, our group, the people who are on this call, we need to be the leaders in this. We are the drug developers. That's what we do for a living. So we need to provide the leadership in this area to show how you do that. How do you answer that question? I've had discussions with academics who are still wondering about how you link the pharmacokinetics with the pharmacology. And you fill in the gap between where you think you can get to and where you need to get to with hope. And that is a disastrous situation. So a call for us to be out there driving this agenda.
Absolutely. Yeah, and have this potential emergence of novel viruses such as COVID, and how we continue to understand that human encroachment, and that how we're even looking about questions that are coming from the audience. How do we see R&D and the development of infectious diseases therapy being conducted remotely, even after the pandemic ends? So have there been some, I like the terminology, Mark, you said, the jewels of the crown that we've learned and we're going to share together as we're evolving and not going back, and we're pledging to move forward as committed leaders to impact change, to design that market for the research, and really to encourage innovation and eliminate the once upon a time inefficiencies, recognizing where we need to trend. So any closing remarks? I know we've got only 2 minutes left. I would love to hear closing remarks in terms of that direction forward. Thank you, Mark. That was very insightful and also motivating and inspiring. Any points, Miss Dr. Amanda, that you may want to share as well?
I mean, I think one of the key themes that's emerged during this discussion that we've all spoken to is the need for better collaboration and coordination, not just to address COVID, but to address all of these things, both what we know about and what is coming in the future. Let's take this opportunity to see what we've learned in terms of how to do trials differently, what's good about that from the situation, how can we apply in the future. But ultimately, the collaboration is going to be key, both in the science as well as all the operational regulatory aspects.
Excellent.
I'd just like to thank the Galien Foundation for the spotlight they put on some of these issues we've been discussing.
Yes, and with that, I think that we are unfortunately out of time. This has been an incredible, engaging discussion. I thoroughly, personally enjoyed it, hearing from the perspectives on how we can affect change and driving innovation in the pandemic for infectious disease. I'd like to thank representatives on this session. Here you have the poll results of what was the most single element of global policy agenda to advance healthcare innovations to improve the human condition. And we have a result. Oh, we got a tie here, guys. Look at this. 31% on universal access to medicines, vaccines, and multilateral collaboration in health policy, which is, again, very much aligned to how we were discussing today as a group, but I would be remiss not to also thank the Galien Foundation. This session will be viewable on the Galien Foundation homepage that will highlight tomorrow's forum. I am welcoming you all in terms of there's a digital as well as a local, but those that are going to be conveniently enjoying the cocktails and award presentation for the 2020 Vagilis Pro Bono Humanitarian Award winner, Dr. William Faggy. So congratulations and thank you panelists for your contributions, and looking forward in partnering and collaborating to drive human health forward. Have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Best pharmaceutical product.